We love to remember Oscar Wilde as a martyr for queer history, but the truth is far uglier. The man who destroyed him was not a judge, nor the public, nor even Victorian law. It was Lord Alfred Douglas, the beautiful, volatile young aristocrat, whose toxic love dragged Wilde into a war he never wanted to fight. Douglas treated forbidden love like a sport, a weapon to use against his own father. Wilde treated it like his heart's salvation. And when the scandal finally exploded, Douglas slipped out of England untouched, while Wilde was left behind to face the police, the courts, and 2 years of brutal hard labor. Before society crushed Oscar Wilde, Douglas had already used him as a shield, spending his money provoking the fight and then abandoning him at the moment of ruin. This is not just a love story. It is the tragic anatomy of a relationship where one man loved deeply and the other loved only destruction. To unmask Alfred Douglas, known to history as Bosie, you must first understand his inheritance. He didn't emerge from a vacuum. He was the product of the House of Queensberry, a lineage so notorious in Britain that they were known as the Mad Bad Line. In the 19th century, biology was destiny, and Douglas carried a toxic legacy. His grandfather died in a shooting accident that everyone knew was a suicide, but the true architect of this disaster was his father, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry. John Sholto Douglas was a terrifying figure. History remembers him for the Queensberry rules, the code that civilized boxing. It is the ultimate irony. The man who brought rules to the ring lived his life with none. He was a brute with a violent temper and a militant atheist who screamed his blasphemies from the rooftops. In the Queensberry household, violence was the only language spoken. Alfred, born in 1870, was the third son. He was small and possessed an angelic beauty, huge blue eyes and golden hair. But beneath that delicate exterior was a spirit hardened by his father's rage. The Marquis bullied his wife until she fled and treated his sons with competitive aggression. Young Alfred learned a fatal lesson early. In that house, the person who screamed the loudest won. He learned that empathy was a weakness and manipulation was a survival skill. Alfred Douglas hated his father, yet he became him. He inherited the Queensberry temper, the arrogance, and the belief that the world existed solely to be bent to his will. By the time Alfred arrived at Oxford, the mold was set. He was no longer a victim. He was a predator in training. He was the golden youth of the university, surrounded by admirers, captivated by his title and looks. He wrote poetry that was mediocre but dripping with narcissism. He was a bad student, but a world-class hedonist. He ran up gambling debts, drank heavily, and explored the underground world of Victorian sexuality. But unlike the cautious men who moved in the shadows, Douglas moved with the reckless entitlement of an aristocrat who believes he is untouchable. He was spoiled, bored, and dangerous. He needed a stage, and he needed a sponsor. In the summer of 1891, the trap was set. Lionel Johnson, a poet and mutual friend, brought Alfred Douglas to tea at Tite Street, the home of Oscar Wilde. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Wilde was 37 years old, a husband, a father of 2 sons, and the most celebrated playwright of his generation. He was a man of immense physical bulk, flamboyant in dress and manner, a conversationalist who could hold entire dinner parties, captive with his wit. He was at the zenith of his career. The Picture of Dorian Gray had been published, scandalizing and enthralling the public. He was rich, famous, and seemingly invulnerable. Then walked in Alfred Douglas. He was 21. He was everything Wilde worshipped in the abstract: noble, young, beautiful, and carrying the glamour of Oxford. Wilde looked at Douglas and saw a Greek myth come to life. He saw an intellectual equal, a muse, a kindred spirit. He looked at the boy and saw art. He should have looked closer. He should have seen the coldness in the eyes. He should have seen that Douglas was not looking for a mentor. He was looking for a bank account and a weapon to use against his father. The relationship that followed was not the romantic tragedy often depicted in soft-focus biopics. It was a hostage situation. From the very beginning, the dynamic was twisted. Wilde was the giver, Douglas was the taker, and Douglas's appetite was bottomless. He did not just want Wilde's affection, he wanted his life. He demanded to be entertained, fed, and clothed in the finest luxury. They dined at the Savoy, the Café Royal, in Kettner's. They stayed in the best suites in the best hotels. Wilde, generous to a fault, poured his earnings into Douglas's pockets, but money was the least of it. Douglas introduced Wilde to a darker world. While Wilde had dabbled in the homosexual subculture before, Douglas acted as a tour guide to the abyss. He introduced Wilde to the renters, young working-class men, often grooms, valets, or out-of-work laborers, who sold sexual favors for a few pounds or a silver cigarette case. Douglas reveled in this danger. He enjoyed the thrill of feasting with panthers, as Wilde later famously described it. For Douglas, this was a rebellion against his father and the stifling Victorian morality. For Wilde, it was a descent into a vulnerability that would eventually kill him. There is a specific incident early in their relationship that exposes the reality of their bond. Douglas had given an old suit to a mesmerizing but unscrupulous young man. In the pocket of that suit, Douglas had carelessly left a letter Wilde had written to him, a letter of poetic, flowery extravagance. This letter fell into the hands of blackmailers. When the criminals approached Wilde, demanding a massive sum to suppress the letter, Wilde handled it with his characteristic wit, dismissing the blackmailers by saying the letter was a prose poem, and he would essentially publish it himself. He managed to talk his way out of it. But note Douglas's reaction. Was he horrified that his carelessness had endangered the most famous writer in London? Was he apologetic? Number. He found it thrilling. He enjoyed the drama. He enjoyed being the center of a crisis. He watched Wilde scramble to fix the mess he had made, and he learned that he could act with impunity because Wilde would always be there to clean up the spill. This established the pattern that would endure for 4 years. Douglas would break something, a law, a heart, a bank account, and Wilde would sweep up the shards, cutting his own hands in the process. As the months turned into years, the love became a form of torture. Douglas was not a kind lover. He was prone to terrible hysterical rages. If Wilde tried to work, Douglas would sulk or create a scene. He would storm out of rooms, slam doors, and send telegrams filled with vitriol. He preyed on Wilde's insecurity about his age and his weight. He made Wilde feel that he was lucky to be seen with such a young, beautiful aristocrat. Friends of Wilde, men like Robert Ross and Pierre Louis, watched in horror. They saw the transformation. They saw the great artist becoming anxious, distracted, and financially drained. They begged Wilde to end it. They told him that Bosie was poison. Wilde tried. He broke it off multiple times. He would flee to Paris or hide in the countryside to write. But Douglas always found him. He would send letters threatening suicide, claiming he was dying of grief, playing the role of the abandoned child perfectly. And Wilde, a man of immense heart and fatal weakness for beauty, would always take him back. He described his inability to resist Douglas as a madness. It was an addiction more potent than the absinthe they drank in the cafes of Soho. Meanwhile, the shadow of the father grew longer. The Marquess of Queensberry was not oblivious. He began to hear the whispers. London was a small town for the aristocracy. The waiters at the Savoy talked, the valets talked. The Marquis realized that his son, whom he already loathed, was parading around town with a playwright known for his effeminacy and aestheticism. For a man like Queensberry, this was not just a moral failing. It was a declaration of war. He saw his son's behavior as a direct insult to his name. The tragedy here is that Douglas wanted his father to know. He didn't hide the relationship. He flaunted it. He took Wilde to the very places where his father's friends dined. He paraded Wilde like a trophy of his rebellion. He wanted the Marquess to see. He wanted to provoke the explosion. Douglas was locked in a psychological death match with his father, and he was using Oscar Wilde as his shield. He knew his father was dangerous. This was a man who walked around London with a horsewhip, looking for people to assault, but Douglas felt protected by Wilde's fame and intellect. He believed that Wilde was invincible. By 1894, the tension was unbearable. The private drama was spilling into the public street. Wilde wrote The Importance of Being Earnest, his masterpiece, a play that sparkles with light and joy. But while he was writing this comedy, his life was becoming a horror story. He was living in a state of constant siege, trapped between the violent threats of the Marquis and the hysterical demands of the son. The financial strain was catastrophic. Wilde was earning a fortune, but he was spending 2 fortunes to keep Douglas happy. The catalyst for the end came not from the law, but from a family dispute. The Marquess began to harass Wilde directly. He showed up at Wilde's house. He made scenes in restaurants. He threatened to thrash Wilde if he caught him with his son. Wilde, a pacifist by nature, was terrified. He wrote to Douglas begging him to stop provoking his father, to be discreet. Douglas laughed. He told Wilde that he was a coward. He told him that he must stand up to the old brute. Douglas was writing the script for a tragedy, and he had cast Wilde as the hero who must slay the dragon. But Wilde was not a dragon slayer. He was an artist. He was soft, in the most human sense of the word. He was not built for the brutality of a street fight with a Scottish Marquis. Yet, slowly, inexorably, Douglas wore him down. He chipped away at Wilde's judgment, his caution, and his sanity. He convinced Wilde that the only way to have peace was to destroy the Marquis. This brings us to the edge of the precipice. It is early 1895. The importance of being earnest opens to rapturous applause. It is the greatest triumph of Wilde's life. The audience cheers. The critics are ecstatic. Wilde stands on the stage of the world, bathed in golden light. But in the shadows of the wings, the Queensberry madness is waiting. The father is loading his gun, and the son is smiling, waiting for the signal to fire. The golden age is over. The iron age is about to begin. The feast with panthers is ending, and the bill is about to be presented, and the cost will not be measured in pounds and shillings, but in flesh and blood. February 28th, 1895. This is the date the bomb went off. It wasn't a literal explosive, but a scrap of pasteboard, a visiting card left at the porter's lodge of the Albemarle Club in London. The man who left it was the Marquis of Queensberry. He was red-faced, muttering and bristling with the manic energy of a man looking for a fight. He handed the card to the porter, Sidney Wright, and told him to give it to Oscar Wilde. The porter looked at the card. It contained a single sentence, scrawled in a barely legible, furious hand. The spelling was atrocious, the grammar non-existent, but the intent was lethal. For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite. He meant sodomite. He couldn't even spell the insult that would define the next century of queer history. But the misspelling didn't matter. The intent was clear. This was a public accusation of a felony. Under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically the Labouchere Amendment, acts of gross indecency between men were punishable by up to 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. Queensberry wasn't just calling Wilde names, he was accusing him of a crime. He was practically daring Wilde to call the police. When Wilde arrived at the club and received the card, he felt a cold dread. He wrote to his friend Robert Ross, "The Tower of Ivory is assailed by the foul thing." He sounded exhausted. At this moment, Wilde's instinct, his survival instinct, was screaming at him. He knew the Marquess was dangerous. He knew that London was a trap. His friends, the rational ones like Ross and Frank Harris, gave him the only advice that mattered. Tear up the card, ignore the madman, go to Paris, take a holiday, let the old fool scream into the void. If Wilde had listened to them, he would have died a wealthy, celebrated old man. But he didn't listen to them. He listened to Alfred Douglas. And this is where Bosie's role shifts from parasite to executioner. When Douglas saw the card, he didn't see a threat to his lover's life. He saw a golden opportunity. He saw the weapon he had been waiting for. For years, Douglas had dreamed of seeing his father in the dock, humiliated, broken, and jailed. He hated his father with a pathology that eclipsed everything else in his life, including his love for Wilde. In fact, Wilde ceased to be a lover in that moment and became a pawn. Douglas went into a frenzy. He screamed that his father must be stopped. He told Wilde that the aristocracy would rally behind them. He claimed that his family, his mother, his brother, would pay the legal costs. He puffed up his chest and played the role of the chivalrous knight defending his honor. Except he wasn't doing the fighting. He was sending the poet to do the brawling. He taunted Wilde. He questioned his manhood. He implied that if Wilde didn't sue, he was a coward letting a bully win. Wilde was tired. He was financially overextended. He was essentially soft. He could not withstand the relentless, high-pitched pressure from the young man he worshipped. Against his better judgment, against the advice of every legal mind he knew, Wilde walked into a police station and applied for a warrant for the arrest of the Marquess of Queensberry for criminal libel. It was the most arrogant, stupid mistake of his life. To win a libel case, Wilde had to prove that the accusation was false. He had to prove he was not posing as a sodomite, which meant he had to prove his moral character was spotless. He was inviting the British legal system to turn the lights on in the cellar of his life, and Bosie cheered him on, clapping his hands like a child at a circus, blind to the fact that the lions were not tame. The preparation for the trial was a farce of hubris. Wilde and Douglas went to lunch at the Café Royal to meet with Edward Clark, the solicitor who would represent Wilde. Clark was a serious moral man. He asked Wilde a direct question. "Is there any truth in this accusation?" Wilde lied. He looked Clark in the eye and said no. He had to lie. If he admitted the truth, Clark would have refused the case. But Bosie sat there and watched Wilde lie. Bosie knew the truth. Bosie had been the one who introduced Wilde to the very underground that made the accusation true. Yet he said nothing. He let Wilde perjure himself to his own lawyer. He let the carriage roll toward the cliff edge, because stopping it would mean canceling the show? While they prepared, the Marquess of Queensberry was not idle. He was not a fool. He hired a private detective named Littlechild. This was not a literary game. This was a street fight. Littlechild didn't care about poetry or art. He went into the gutters of London. He found the rent boys. He found the blackmailers. He found the discarded lovers. And he found them easily because Wilde and Douglas had been incredibly reckless. They had left a trail of cigarette cases, signed photographs, and checks. The detectives found a young man named Charles Parker. Parker was a valet, essentially a prostitute, whom Wilde had wined and dined. Parker was bitter and broke. For a small sum, he sang. Then they found Alfred Wood. Then they found the hotel chambermaids who had seen young men in Wilde's bed. They built a dossier of evidence that was so overwhelming it was almost comical. Wilde knew none of this. He was living in a fantasy world constructed by Bosie, where their noble love would triumph over the brute Philistine father. They even went on a holiday to Monte Carlo before the trial, gambling and drinking, treating the upcoming court date as a mere formality. Bosie assured Wilde that his father wouldn't dare show up, or if he did, he would have no evidence. It was a delusion of grandeur shared by two men who had never been told no. The trial of Wilde versus Queensberry opened at the Old Bailey in April 1895. The courtroom was packed. It was the hottest ticket in London. The atmosphere was electric, but it was the electricity of a lynch mob disguised in top hats. When the trial began, Wilde was the prosecutor. He was the one pressing charges. He entered the box with an air of boredom and superiority. He cracked jokes. When asked about his writings, he dazzled the court with epigrams. He made the gallery laugh for a few hours. It seemed like he might actually pull it off. He was treating the Old Bailey like a theater, and he was the star. But then the defense counsel stood up. His name was Edward Carson. Carson was everything Wilde was not. He was Irish, like Wilde. They had been contemporaries at Trinity College, Dublin. But he was dour, severe, factual, and devoid of humor. He was a man of statutes and hard evidence. He did not care about art. He cared about facts. Carson began his cross-examination. He started softly. He asked about Wilde's age. Wilde lied, shaving a year off. Carson produced a birth certificate. The trap clicked shut. Wilde was shown to be a liar on a minor point. If he would lie about his age, what else would he lie about? Then Carson moved to the letters. He read the flowery, romantic letters Wilde had written to Bosie. He read the line, "Your slim, gilt soul that walks between passion and poetry." "Is this an ordinary letter for one man to write to another?" Carson asked. "It was not an ordinary letter," Wilde replied haughtily. "It was a work of art." "I see," said Carson. "And is it a work of art to pay a boy named Alfie Wood £10 for a night?" The mood in the courtroom shifted. The laughter died. The air became heavy and suffocating. Carson stopped asking about books and started asking about boys. He had names, he had dates, he had locations. "Did you know a lad named Alfonso Conway?" "Yes." "Was he a newspaper boy?" "He was." "Did you buy him a suit of blue serge?" "I did." "Did you take him to Brighton?" "Yes." "Did you kiss him?" This was the moment, the pivot point of a life. Wilde, feeling confident, feeling that he was intellectually superior to this lawyer, made a quip, a joke. "Oh, dear no," Wilde said, smiling. He was a peculiarly plain boy. Silence. It was a fatal slip, a catastrophic error. By saying he didn't kiss him because he was ugly, Wilde had implicitly admitted that he would have kissed him if he were pretty. Carson pounced like a wolf. "Because he was plain? Is that the reason? So if he had been beautiful, you would have?" Wilde stammered. He tried to backtrack. He flustered. "I don't kiss wallflowers," he muttered, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. The arrogance had revealed the predator beneath. For the next 2 days, Carson flayed Wilde alive. He dragged the aesthetic movement into the mud. He exposed the reality of Wilde's life with Douglas, the champagne dinners with rough trade, the soiled sheets in hotel rooms, the intricate web of payments and silence. And where was Alfred Douglas? He was watching. He was in the courtroom, at least initially, but he was not called to the stand. Wilde's lawyers, realizing that Douglas was a liability, refused to let him testify. This infuriated Bosie. He wanted to get up there and scream at his father. He wanted his monologue. When he was denied his moment in the spotlight, he sulked. He didn't care that Wilde was being destroyed. He cared that he was being silenced. The reality of the situation finally penetrated Wilde's denial. On the third day, his solicitor, Edward Clark, approached him. "We cannot win," he said grimly. "The defense is about to call the witnesses. They have the boys waiting in the witness room. If we proceed, they will testify. We must withdraw the prosecution." To withdraw was to surrender. It was to admit that the libel was not a libel, that the accusation was true. Wilde, pale and shaking, agreed. The case against the Marquis of Queensberry was dropped. The Marquis was acquitted. He walked out of the dock a free man, the victor, the vindicated father who had saved his son from a predator. But Queensberry wasn't finished. He was a man of vengeance. As soon as the trial ended, he took the bundle of evidence, the witness statements from the rent boys, the hotel bills, the letters, and he sent them to the director of public prosecutions. "Here," he effectively said, "he admits he is a sodomite. Arrest him." The machinery of the Victorian state, which moved slowly for the poor, moved with terrifying speed for Oscar Wilde. A warrant was issued within hours. Wilde had a window of time. There was a gap between the end of the trial and the issuing of the warrant. About 4 or 5 hours. His friends begged him to leave. The boat train for France was leaving. He could have made it. He could have run. But Wilde sat in the Cadogan Hotel, paralyzed. He drank hock and seltzer. He smoked cigarette after cigarette. He seemed to have entered a state of shock. He was waiting for the inevitable. Bosie was there, useless as ever. He did not organize an escape. He did not hire a private carriage. He flitted around hysterical, making noise, offering no solutions. At 6:10 p.m., there was a knock on the door of room 118. 2 detectives entered. "Mr. Wilde?" "Yes." "We have a warrant for your arrest." Wilde stood up. He grabbed his coat. He did not fight. The tragedy had moved from the drawing room to the police station. The most famous man in London was now a prisoner. And what did Lord Alfred Douglas do? The moment Wilde was arrested, the moment the handcuffs clicked, metaphorically, as he wasn't cuffed until later, Douglas's protection evaporated. He was still the son of the Marquis. He was still an aristocrat. The police were not coming for him. The Crown did not want to put a lord on trial. They wanted the writer, the outsider, the corrupter. While Wilde spent his first night in a cold, reeking cell at Bow Street Police Court, listening to the screams of drunks and thieves, Alfred Douglas returned to his hotel. He was safe. He had started a fire that burned down the house, but he had walked out the back door without a singed eyebrow. The betrayal was not yet complete, but the pattern was set. Wilde was in the abyss. Bosie was still on the surface, looking down, convinced that he was the victim in all this. He wrote letters to the newspapers. He claimed he would stand by Wilde, but talk is cheap and lawyers are expensive. As Wilde sat in that cell, staring at the gray walls, he might have wondered about the calling card, that stupid misspelled card. If he had just torn it up, if he had just laughed. But vanity is a powerful drug, and Bosie had been the pusher. Now the high was over, and the withdrawal would be fatal. The first act of the destruction was over. The civil trial was lost. Now the criminal trial would begin, the Crown versus Oscar Wilde. And this time, there would be no witty repartee. There would only be the grinding gears of a system designed to crush men like bugs. The crash was absolute. In the span of 24 hours, Oscar Wilde went from the most celebrated guest in London to an untouchable pariah. He was denied bail. He was thrown into Holloway Prison, a holding facility that was cold, filthy, and echoing with the sounds of misery. He was not yet a convict, but he was treated like a leper. While Wilde sat in a cell shivering in his velvet coat, the world he had built was being dismantled brick by brick. His home, On Tite Street, the sanctuary of the aesthetic movement, was raided. Creditors, sensing blood in the water, descended like vultures. The Marquis of Queensberry had bankrupted him with legal costs, and now the tradesmen wanted their pound of flesh. The sheriff's men seized his property. It was a looting disguised as an auction. The beautiful things Wilde had collected, the first editions, the Whistler paintings, the blue and white china, were sold for pennies. The crowd that gathered was not there to buy art. They were there to scavenge souvenirs from a scandal. They stole things. They broke things. The house was stripped bare. Even the toys of his two young sons, Cyril and Vivian, were sold. The boys were whisked away by their mother, Constance, who was humiliated and heartbroken. She changed their surname to Holland to shield them from the radioactive toxicity of their father's name. Wilde's family was erased while he sat in a cell, unable to do a thing. And where was Alfred Douglas? He was gone. On the advice of lawyers who feared that he too would be arrested if he stayed in London, Douglas boarded a ferry to France. He fled to the Hôtel de la Poste in Rouen. From the safety of the continent, he wrote letters. He wrote to the newspapers. He wrote to Wilde. He claimed that he wanted to stay, that he was forced to leave, that his heart was breaking. But let us be clear, he was safe. While Wilde was eating gruel and sleeping on a plank, Douglas was dining in French bistros, drinking wine, and playing the role of the tragic exile. He wrote to Wilde saying, "Do not think I am not suffering. I am suffering more than you." The arrogance of that sentence is breathtaking. Douglas, free and wealthy, dared to tell the man locked in a cage that he was the one in pain. It was the ultimate expression of his narcissism. He could not stand that the tragedy was no longer about him. On April 26, 1895, the first criminal trial began at the Old Bailey. Wilde stood in the dock, looking haggard and gray. He was charged with 25 counts of gross indecency. Beside him stood Alfred Taylor, a procurer who had arranged many of the meetings with the young men. The prosecution was relentless. They paraded the witnesses, Charles Parker, Alfred Wood, and others. These young men who had once drank Wilde's champagne and laughed at his jokes now pointed fingers and detailed every sexual act for the jury. They had been granted immunity in exchange for their testimony. They were saving their own skins by flaying Wilde's. But then, a moment of defiance. During the trial, the prosecutor asked Wilde to explain a line from a poem by Douglas, which mentioned the love that dare not speak its name. The prosecutor implied it was a reference to sodomy. Wilde stood up. For a moment, the old spark returned. He delivered a speech that silenced the courtroom. He spoke of the love between an older man and a younger man as intellectual, pure and noble, the love of Plato, of Michelangelo, of Shakespeare. He defended the indefensible with such eloquence that the gallery burst into applause. For a fleeting second, it seemed art might triumph over law. The jury was confused. They were repulsed by the evidence, but mesmerized by the man. After hours of deliberation, they returned. They could not agree on a verdict. It was a hung jury. Wilde was not acquitted, but he was not convicted. A retrial was ordered. In the interim, the judge granted bail. The sum was staggering, £5,000, a fortune in those days. Wilde's friends, including the loyal Reverend Stuart Headlam and Lord Douglas of Hawick, Bosie's brother, who hated his father enough to help Wilde, put up the money. On May 7th, Wilde was released on bail. He had 3 weeks before the next trial. 3 weeks of freedom. But it was not freedom. It was a hunt. Wilde walked out of the court and hailed a cab. He went to the hotel where he usually stayed. The manager blocked the door. "You cannot enter here." He went to another hotel. Same answer. "We do not want your kind." He went to a third, then a fourth. London had closed its doors. The man who had once been the toast of society was now a contagion. He was chased through the streets by a mob of reporters and jeering onlookers. He was a wounded animal with nowhere to hide. Desperate, late at night, he ended up at his mother's house. Lady Jane Wilde was old and dying. She was a fierce Irish nationalist, a woman of iron pride. When her broken son arrived, she did not comfort him. She told him he must stay and fight. She told him that if he fled to France, he would be a coward. An Irish gentleman does not run away, she said. Wilde had a choice during these 3 weeks. The ports were watched, but not perfectly. Friends urged him to run. Go to France, Oscar. The government wants you to run. They don't want to imprison a celebrity. Just go. But he stayed. Why? Partly because of his mother, but mostly because of Bosie. From France, Douglas kept up the pressure. He wrote daily. He told Wilde that they were martyrs. He told Wilde that running away would be a victory for the Philistines and for his hated father, Queensberry. Douglas needed Wilde to be a sacrifice. If Wilde ran, the story became a farce. If Wilde stayed and suffered, it became a tragedy. And Douglas loved a tragedy. Wilde, paralyzed by a strange fatalism, stayed. He sat in his brother's house, drinking heavily, waiting for the end. On May 20th, the second trial began. This time, the Crown did not make mistakes. They brought in the Solicitor General, Sir Frank Lockwood, to prosecute. Lockwood was a shark. He didn't care about poetry. He cut through Wilde's rhetoric. He focused purely on the facts, the bedsheets, the feces stains, the money trails, the gifts. He stripped away the Greek ideal and left only the gritty reality of sex in cheap hotels. Wilde was exhausted. He didn't make speeches this time. He slumped in the dock. He looked like a man who was already dead. On May 25, 1895, the jury returned. The deliberation was short. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom erupted. Cheers from the public gallery. The judge, Mr. Justice Wills, looked at Wilde with undisguised disgust. He delivered a sentence that he clearly wished could be harsher. "It is the worst case I have ever tried," the judge intoned. "That you, a man of education and culture, should have corrupted these young men. I shall pass the severest sentence that the law allows. In my judgment, it is totally inadequate. 2 years imprisonment with hard labor." Wilde swayed. He tried to speak. "And I? May I say nothing, my lord?" The judge waved his hand. "Take him down." The warders grabbed him. He was dragged down the steps to the holding cells, the screams of shame ringing in his ears. This was the end of Oscar Wilde, the man. The prisoner began. But the true horror was not just the sentence. It was the transfer. A few months into his sentence, Wilde was moved from Wandsworth Prison to Reading Jail. The transfer was mishandled. He was taken to Clapham Junction Station in his convict uniform. Arrows stamped on the fabric, handcuffed, chained to a warden. It was midday. The platform was crowded. People recognized him. "It's Wilde. It's the sodomite." A crowd formed. They didn't look away in pity. They laughed. They jeered. One man stepped forward and spat in his face. Wilde could not wipe it off because his hands were cuffed. He stood there, the spittle running down his cheek, tears streaming from his eyes, while the crowd howled with laughter. In De Profundis, Wilde later wrote of this moment, "When people wish to weep, they do so for a sweet thing. When they wish to laugh, they do so for a grotesque thing. I was a grotesque thing." This moment at Clapham Junction broke something in him that never healed. It was the total annihilation of his dignity. And where was the other half of this great romance? Where was Bosie? Bosie was in France, writing poems about his own suffering. He was trying to publish articles defending Wilde, but his tone was always self-serving. He was the hero fighting the system. Wilde was just the casualty. He did not visit. He could not visit. But he also did not send money to help Wilde's bankrupt estate. He did not help Constance or the children. Inside Reading jail, the reality of hard labor set in. The system was designed to break a man's body and spirit. Wilde was confined to a cell that measured 13 by 7 feet. He was forbidden from speaking to anyone. The silence was absolute. If he was caught whispering, he was punished. The food was inedible, gruel, sweet, dry bread. Wilde, a man who loved fine dining, began to starve. He lost weight rapidly. His clothes hung off him. He suffered from dysentery. The stench in the cell was unbearable. He was forced to walk the treadmill, a giant rotating wheel that prisoners had to climb for hours, grinding air. It was pointless, exhausting torture. Or he had to pick oakum, tearing apart old tarred ropes with his bare fingers until they bled. Wilde's health collapsed. He fell in his cell and ruptured his eardrum. He was left lying on the stone floor for hours before anyone came. That injury would never heal. It would be the infection that eventually killed him. For the first year, he was not allowed paper or pen. He had no outlet. His mind, once the most brilliant in Europe, was turning in on itself. He was going mad. He memorized the cracks in the wall. He wept until he had no tears left. But the worst torture was the silence from the outside. He heard nothing from Bosie. Wilde began to realize the truth. He was serving time for two. He was in prison for the life they had led together. Douglas was the one who had introduced him to the rent boys. Douglas was the one who had escalated the fight with Queensberry. Douglas was the one who had spent the money. Yet Douglas was free. The unfairness of it began to ferment in Wilde's soul. The love turned into something bitter. Ideally, a lover waits, a lover supports, but Douglas was moving on. He was planning to publish Wilde's letters, the very letters that had been used to convict him, in a book to make money. When Wilde heard this from a visitor, he was devastated. "He is selling my love to the world," Wilde whispered. The golden boy was stripping the carcass before it was even cold. As 1896 dragged on, Wilde sat in the dark, picking at the tarred rope with bleeding fingers. And finally he began to hate. The hate was slow, cold, and terrible. It was the realization that he had destroyed his life for a hallucination. He had worshipped a God who was actually a monster. In the purgatory of Reading jail, a change occurred. It was not a change of heart, but a change of administration. The sadistic governor who had overseen Wilde's early torture was replaced by a man named Major Nelson. Nelson was a soldier, but he possessed a humanity his predecessor lacked. He looked at prisoner C. 3.3 and saw not a monster, but a man who was disintegrating. He could not bend the rules enough to release him, nor could he improve the food, but he could grant one mercy: paper and ink. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Oscar Wilde was allowed to write, but he was not writing a play. He was not writing a comedy about cucumber sandwiches. He was writing an autopsy of his own soul. From January to March 1897, Wilde sat in his cold cell, consuming sheet after sheet of blue prison paper. He was allowed only one sheet at a time. The completed pages were taken away by the wardens before a new blank one was given. He could not read back what he had written. He had to hold the entire structure of the work in his head, a feat of memory and concentration that serves as a testament to his genius, even in the depths of his misery. The result was De Profundis, from the depths. It was addressed to Alfred Douglas. History often categorizes De Profundis as a love letter. It is not. It is an indictment. It is a 50,000-word scream of pain. For years, Wilde had romanticized Douglas, excusing his tantrums as artistic temperament and his selfishness as nobility. But prison had stripped away the illusions. In the dark, Wilde finally saw Douglas clearly. He wrote with a brutal forensic precision, I blame myself for allowing an unintellectual friendship, a friendship whose primary aim was not the creation and contemplation of beautiful things, but entirely solely the terrible waste of life. You were the absolute ruin of my art. He cataloged the money. He cataloged the scenes. He reminded Douglas of the time Wilde was sick with fever in Brighton, and Douglas had left him because he found a sick room boring, charging the hotel bill to Wilde's account as he walked out. He reminded Douglas of the silence during the trial. When you are not on your pedestal, you are not interesting, Wilde wrote. The next time you are in trouble, I will not help you. The letter was meant to be delivered to Douglas upon Wilde's release. It was meant to be the final word, the closure, the severance of the cord. Wilde poured his hatred, his love, his regret, and his forgiveness into those pages, hoping that by writing it down, he could exorcise the ghost of Bosie from his blood. But the tragedy of De Profundis is not what was written, but how it was received. When Wilde was finally released, the manuscript was entrusted to Robert Ross, his loyal literary executor. Ross typed it up and sent a copy to Douglas. Did Douglas read it? Did he weep? Did he finally understand the magnitude of the suffering he had caused? No. He read the first few pages, found the tone depressing, and threw it into the fire. He famously remarked, "I never read the thing. It was too long and too full of complaints." The profundity of Wilde's suffering met the shallowness of Douglas's soul, and it bounced off without leaving a scratch. Douglas didn't want to hear about suffering. He wanted to know if Wilde still loved him. May 19th, 1897, the day of release. Wilde was smuggled out of Reading jail early in the morning to avoid the press. He was transferred to a train, then a boat. He stood on the deck of the ferry crossing the English Channel to Dieppe, breathing the sea air. He was 42 years old, but he looked 60. His hair was graying, his teeth were rotting, and he walked with a limp. He was no longer Oscar Wilde, the toast of London. He was Sebastian Melmoth. He had chosen the alias from a Gothic novel, Melmoth the Wanderer. It was a fitting name for a ghost. Upon arriving in France, Wilde had simple goals: to live quietly, to reconcile with his wife Constance, and to never see Alfred Douglas again. His friends, especially Robert Ross, did everything to support this. They knew that Douglas was the trigger for the addiction. If Wilde stayed away from Bosie, he might survive. If he went back, he was dead. For a few weeks it seemed to work. Wilde settled in a small village called Berneval-sur-Mer. He wrote to friends. He visited the local church. He was gentle, humble, and seemingly cured of his arrogance. He wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol during this time. His last great work, a haunting poem about the execution of a fellow prisoner. It showed a new Oscar Wilde, a man who understood the brotherhood of pain. But the vacuum of his life was too vast. The silence was too loud. Constance refused to see him immediately. She had set conditions, a year of probation. She sent him a small allowance, but she kept the children away. Wilde missed his sons desperately. He had not seen them for 2 years, and he would never see them again. The loneliness began to eat at his resolve, and then the letters started coming. Bosie had found out where he was, Douglas wrote to him, but he didn't write apologies. He didn't write about De Profundis. He wrote about himself. He wrote that he was lonely. He wrote that he loved Oscar. He wrote that they were Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers whom the world was trying to separate. "Do not listen to the bitter little men around you," Douglas wrote. "They do not understand us. We belong together." It was the siren song. Wilde tried to resist. He wrote back, angry at first. He told Douglas not to come. He told him about the damage he had done, but Douglas persisted. He knew which buttons to push. He appealed to Wilde's vanity. He appealed to the dramatic narrative. If we do not meet, Douglas argued, then the Philistines have won. They have separated us. We must show them that love is stronger than prison. It was a lie, of course. It wasn't about love. It was about defiance. But to a man who had been stripped of everything, the idea of one final defiant act was intoxicating. Wilde began to waver. He was bored in the village. He was lonely. And he remembered the beauty. He forgot the tantrums. He remembered the golden hair. He forgot the selfishness. He remembered the adoration. In August 1897, the inevitable happened. The gravitational pull of the disaster was too strong. Wilde wrote to a friend, "I love him. I have always loved him. He ruined my life, and for that reason I seem forced to love him." It is the logic of the abused. The victim returns to the abuser because the abuse is the only intense feeling left in a numb world. They agreed to meet in Rouen. The reunion was electric. When Wilde saw Douglas at the train station, the 2 years of hell evaporated. They wept. They embraced. Wilde looked at the face that had launched 1,000 ships of legal paper and saw only his boy. Douglas was charming. He was affectionate. He swore he had changed. He swore they would live quietly, devoted to art. They made a decision that shocked everyone. They would go to Naples. Naples was the perfect backdrop for a tragedy, beautiful, decaying, volcanic, and filled with the memories of empires that had fallen. It was a city of pleasure and death. When the news reached London, Wilde's friends were horrified. Robert Ross was so angry he refused to write. Constance Wilde was devastated. She had held out hope that her husband would reform. When she heard he had gone back to Douglas, she cut the final thread. She stopped his allowance. "He has returned to his vomit," she wrote. It was a biblical, brutal condemnation. Wilde didn't care, not yet. He was in Naples with Bosie. They rented a villa, the Villa Giudice. For a few weeks, they lived a fantasy. They were the outcasts, the rebels, the lovers against the world. But they had forgotten one thing, reality. And reality in a capitalist world is money. Neither of them had any. Wilde's plays were not being performed. His books were out of print. He had no income. Douglas had an allowance from his mother and his brother, but it was conditional. He would only receive it if he stayed away from Wilde. The Queensberry family was still pulling the strings. The Marchioness of Queensberry, Bosie's mother, and the Marquess, his father, threatened to cut off all funds if the scandalous cohabitation continued. So, the idyllic autumn in Naples turned into a winter of discontent. The villa was cold, the food was scarce, the wine ran out. And when the luxury disappeared, the real Alfred Douglas reappeared. The tantrums returned. Douglas was bored. Naples was dull without money. He resented Wilde's poverty. He resented that Wilde was too depressed to be entertaining. He began to leave the villa for days, looking for other amusements in the city. Wilde sat in the cold villa, writing letters begging for money, realizing with a sinking heart that he had made the mistake of his life. He had sacrificed his wife, his children, his friends, and his redemption for a second chance with Bosie. And Bosie was already checking the train schedules. The climax of this section is not a shout, but a whimper. It is December 1897. The money is gone. Douglas received a letter from his mother. She offered to pay his debts and restore his allowance on one condition: he must leave Wilde immediately and return to England. A true lover, a Romeo, might have said no. He might have said, "I will starve with my beloved." Bosie didn't hesitate. He packed his bags. He told Wilde it was for the best. He told him it was just temporary. He told him he would send money. He lied. Wilde stood at the door of the Villa Giudice and watched the carriage pull away. He was alone in the Italy. He had no money to pay the rent. He had no way to get home. He had been abandoned again by the same man for the same reason. The cycle was complete. Wilde wrote to Ross, "Bosie has left me. He has left me without a penny. I have lived to find that my heart is made of stone, for it does not break." He was wrong. His heart was not made of stone. It was broken beyond repair. The man who stood in the doorway of that villa was not the man who had entered prison. That man had hope. This man had nothing. He had played his final card, and the house had won. The romance was officially over. Now only the dying remained. Paris, 1898, the city of light. But for Sebastian Melmoth, the man formerly known as Oscar Wilde, it was a city of shadows. After being abandoned in Naples, Wilde drifted back to Paris. He was 43, but he moved like an old man. The bounce was gone from his step. The velvet coats and green carnations were gone, replaced by second-hand suits that didn't quite fit his bloated frame. He lived in cheap hotels on the left bank, moving whenever the proprietors threatened to call the police for unpaid bills. This period of his life is often glossed over in biographies as a tragic epilogue, but we must look at it closely because it is the crime scene where the murder was finalized. Alfred Douglas had not just broken Wilde's heart, he had broken his will to create. Wilde sat in cafes for hours, drinking absinthe, staring at the street. When friends urged him to write another play to restore his fortune, he would smile a broken, toothless smile and say, "I have written all there is to write. I wrote when I did not know life. Now that I know the meaning of life, I have nothing to write." He became a cadger. It is a brutal word, but accurate. The once great aesthete, who had thrown gold sovereigns to beggars, now had to beg for his own dinner. He would spot an acquaintance in a cafe, often someone who tried to hide behind a newspaper to avoid him, and he would charm them, wheedle them, and eventually borrow 5 francs. He spent it on alcohol. He was trying to numb the silence in his head. And where was the great love of his life? Alfred Douglas was back in England. He had reconciled with his family. The moment he agreed to abandon Wilde, the money spigot was turned back on. He was living in luxury again. His father, the Marquis of Queensberry, died in 1900, leaving Bosie a substantial inheritance. The mad Marquis had won. He had destroyed Wilde, separated the lovers, and died believing he had saved his son. But Douglas was not saved. He was merely well-funded. He occasionally sent Wilde small checks, £10 here, £5 there, but they were always accompanied by letters that were cold, defensive, or complaining. He treated Wilde like a distant, embarrassing relative who needed to be paid off to stay quiet. In April 1898, a telegram arrived for Wilde in Paris. It brought news from Genoa. Constance was dead, his wife, the woman he had humiliated, the mother of his sons, the woman who had changed her name and fled the country to escape his scandal. She had died after a botched surgery for a spinal issue. She was 40 years old. Wilde was devastated. He traveled to the cemetery in Genoa to visit her grave. When he saw the simple stone, he broke down. He realized with a clarity that cut like a knife that he had traded a woman of infinite patience and grace for a boy of infinite vanity. He wrote, "I was deeply affected. Tragedy seems to dog my footsteps." He placed flowers on the grave of the woman whose life he had ruined, weeping for her and for himself. Back in Paris, the decline accelerated. Wilde developed a terrible rash all over his body, a symptom of late-stage syphilis, or perhaps a reaction to the mussels he had eaten in prison. The diagnosis remains debated, but the misery was undeniable. He was in pain. He was lonely. In 1899, he moved into the Hôtel d'Alsace on the Rue des Beaux-Arts. It was a dingy, third-rate establishment, but the landlord, Jean du Poirier, was a kind man who allowed Wilde to stay on credit. Wilde occupied a room with peeling wallpaper. He looked at it with his old, irrepressible wit and said, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has to go." It was a flash of the old Oscar, but the duel was real, and the wallpaper was winning. By October 1900, Wilde was bedridden. The ear injury he had sustained in Reading jail had become infected. It turned into meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain. The pain was excruciating. He required daily morphine injections. He drifted in and out of delirium. He wrote to Bosie. He begged him to come. "I am ill," he wrote. "I am dying. Come to me." Bosie was in Scotland shooting grouse. He was busy. He was rich. He was bored with Wilde's constant complaints about money and health. He did not come. He did not send a large sum to pay for a better doctor. He replied that he would come when he could. The final days of Oscar Wilde are a testament to the loyalty of true friendship and the stark absence of the false one. Robert Ross, the man who had loved Wilde long before Bosie, the man Wilde had often sidelined, came to Paris. He sat by the bedside. He wiped the sweat from Wilde's brow. He arranged for a priest. On November 29, 1900, Wilde was barely conscious. Ross, knowing Wilde's lifelong fascination with Catholicism, brought in a Passionist priest, Father Dunn. Wilde could not speak, but he raised his hand to signal assent. He was baptized into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. He received the last rites. The next day, November 30th, around 2 p.m., the breathing stopped. The rattling in the throat ceased. Oscar Wilde was dead at 46. He died owing the hotel owner thousands of francs. He died with nothing, and Alfred Douglas was not there. Bosie arrived in Paris 2 days later. He showed up for the funeral. This is the scene that should make your blood run cold. Alfred Douglas, dressed in an immaculate black suit, looking every inch the grieving aristocrat, arrived at the Hôtel d'Alsace. He looked at the body of the man who had loved him to the point of self-destruction. And what did he do? Did he pay the funeral expenses? No. Robert Ross paid them. Did he pay the hotel bill? No. Ross promised to pay it later. Did he offer to support Wilde's sons? No. Bosie stood at the grave at the Cimetière de Bagneux. Wilde was later moved to Père Lachaise. He reportedly almost fell into the open grave, engaging in a dramatic display of grief. He sobbed. He acted the part of the chief mourner. Robert Ross watched this performance with a cold fury. He knew the truth. He knew that Bosie had ignored the dying man's pleas. He knew that this display was for the audience, not for Oscar. After the funeral, Douglas went back to London. He was now free. The scandal was buried in the French soil. He was young, only 30 years old. He was rich. He was titled. He decided that it was time to close the book on Oscar Wilde and start the book of Lord Alfred Douglas. But history is not so easily rewritten. The years following Wilde's death saw a strange transformation in Douglas. He tried to become normal. In 1902, he married Olive Constance, a rich heiress and poetess. It was a shock to society. The notorious homosexual was marrying a woman. They had a son, Raymond. For a brief moment, it looked like Bosie might escape his past. He bought a country house. He hunted. He played the role of the country squire. But the rot was inside him. You cannot build a house on a foundation of betrayal. The marriage was a disaster. Bosie was not a husband. He was a child who needed constant attention. He spent money recklessly. He treated Olive poorly. And inevitably, he began to obsess over his reputation. He realized that as long as the world remembered Oscar Wilde as a martyr, it would remember Alfred Douglas as a villain. The publication of heavily edited versions of De Profundis made him paranoid. Ironically, the man who claimed he never read Wilde's prison letter now became obsessed with suppressing it. He knew the full text existed somewhere. He knew there was a secret letter that exposed him. So he began to sue. This became his career. He didn't write great poetry. He wrote lawsuits. He sued anyone who linked his name to Wilde's downfall. He sued biographers. He sued newspapers. He became the most litigious man in London. In 1911, Douglas converted to Roman Catholicism, weaponizing his new morality to attack Wilde's memory and sue anyone who linked him to the scandal. This obsession culminated in 1923 when he attacked Winston Churchill with a lunatic conspiracy theory. Churchill, unlike Wilde, fought back instantly. He sued for libel, and in a twist of poetic justice, Douglas was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Even prison could not crack the mirror. By the 1930s, Douglas was an old man. He was broke again. He had blown his inheritance on lawsuits and gambling. He was living in a small flat in Hove, supported by the charity of others. His wife had left him. His son Raymond had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed to a mental asylum, a tragic echo of the Queensberry madness. And then the final twist. As he approached death, the pendulum swung one last time. The anger burned out. The energy to hate evaporated. In his final autobiography, Without Apology, 1938, and in his later years, he softened. He stopped calling Wilde a monster. He started to admit, grudgingly, that perhaps he had been difficult. "I was a very young man," he would say. "I was spoiled." He began to claim that he had really loved Wilde after all. He tried to reclaim the position of muse. Why? Because he realized that without Wilde, he was nobody. The world didn't care about Lord Alfred Douglas the poet, or the Catholic, or the moralist. The world only cared about Bosie, the boy who destroyed Oscar Wilde. If he wanted to be remembered, he had to hug the corpse. So, in the shivering cold of his final winters, the old man would sit by the fire and tell stories about the 1890s. He would talk about the Savoy and the gold-tipped cigarettes and the brilliance of Oscar. He became the curator of the very tragedy he had caused. But there is one final hidden story that seals the horror of this relationship. It is the story of the preface. When Frank Harris wrote his biography of Wilde in 1916, Douglas threatened to sue him. But then they made a deal. Douglas agreed to co-write a preface to the book. In this preface, Douglas wrote, "I am not a hypocrite. I was never a sodomite. I was Oscar's friend, but I never did those things." Years later, a letter was found in a private collection. It was a letter Douglas had written to his own lawyer in the 1920s, admitting everything. He admitted the boys, the blackmailers, the life. He had lied to the courts. He had lied to the priests. He had lied to the world for 50 years. He knew exactly what he was. He just didn't have the courage to pay the price for it. Wilde paid the price for both of them. The end was coming. The Second World War broke out. The bombs fell on London just as the gavel had fallen on Wilde. Bosie was old, frail, and forgotten. The golden boy was now a skeleton with white hair. He had outlived the Queen, the Edwardian era, and the peace of Europe. He was a relic. And as he lay dying, the question remained, did he feel guilt? Or was he, to the very last breath, a Queensberry? In the damp gray winter of 1944, the world was burning. Europe was tearing itself apart for the second time in a century. But in a small, cluttered farmhouse in Lansing, Sussex, an old man was fighting a much older war, a war against his own memory. Lord Alfred Douglas was now 74. The face that had once stopped traffic in Oxford, the face that Oscar Wilde had compared to narcissus flowers and Greek statues, was gone. In its place was a hooked nose, a jutting chin, and eyes that were watery and resentful. He was stooped, frail, and constantly cold. He wore layers of ragged cardigans and huddled by a coal fire that he struggled to afford. The irony of his final years is almost too perfect to be fiction. The man who had once stayed at the Savoy and demanded the finest champagne was now living on the charity of a wealthy eccentric named Edward Coleman. Coleman, an admirer of Douglas's poetry, one of the few left, had given him the farmhouse to live in. Douglas, true to form, accepted the charity as his birthright, but complained about the draft. He spent his days writing letters. He wrote to the government complaining about the war rationing. He wrote to the few friends who hadn't died or abandoned him. And he wrote about Oscar. Even as the bombs fell on London, Douglas could not stop talking about the 1890s. It was his obsession. It was the only time he felt alive. When young visitors came to see him, often students or aspiring writers, morbidly curious to see the fatal lord, Douglas would perk up. He would lean forward, his hands trembling, and say, "You want to know about Oscar? I will tell you, he was magnificent. He was terrible. He was a genius. He was a fool." He would vacillate wildly. One minute, Wilde was the love of his life. The next, he was the corrupter. It was as if the two men were still arguing in that farmhouse 45 years after one of them had died. Wilde was the ghost that refused to leave the room, but there was a deeper tragedy playing out in the background, one that echoed the Queensberry curse. Douglas's only son, Raymond, was gone. Not dead, but gone. Raymond had inherited the mental instability of the Douglas line. Diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in his 20s, he had been committed to St. Andrew's Hospital, a mental institution. For years, Douglas had railed against his own father, the Mad Marquis. Now he had to watch his own son succumb to the same madness. He visited Raymond when he could, but the visits were agonizing. The son he had hoped would redeem the family name was lost in a fog of delusions. The Douglas bloodline, which had produced boxing rules and disastrous lovers, was ending in silence. By early 1945, Douglas's health was failing. His heart, which had pumped with such selfish vigor for 7 decades, was giving out. He moved out of the farmhouse to a friend's house in Lansing, unable to care for himself. He was not afraid of death. In fact, he welcomed it. He was a devout Catholic now, convinced of his own salvation. He believed he had done his penance. He believed that his years of poverty and persecution, as he called it, had scrubbed his soul clean. It is a staggering level of delusion. Here was a man who had never publicly apologized to the Wilde family. He had never made restitution to the sons of Oscar Wilde, Cyril, who was killed by a sniper in WWI, and Vivian, who lived a quiet, scarred life. He went to his deathbed believing he was the victim. On the morning of March 20th, 1945, Lord Alfred Douglas died of congestive heart failure. He was 74 years old. There were no crowds outside his window. There were no weeping fans. The world was too busy counting the dead of World War II to care about the death of a Victorian relic. He was buried in the Franciscan Friary in Crawley. His tombstone is simple. It does not mention Oscar Wilde, but the grave cannot hide the truth. When the news of his death reached the papers, the obituaries were polite but distant. They mentioned his poetry. They mentioned his title. But every single one of them, in the first or second paragraph, mentioned Oscar Wilde. He had fought for half a century to be his own man, to be Lord Alfred Douglas, the poet. But in death, he was just Bosie. He was a footnote. He was the appendix in the biography of a greater man. History has a way of correcting the scales that the law gets wrong. Today, if you travel to Paris, to the Père Lachaise Cemetery, you will find the tomb of Oscar Wilde. It is a massive modernist sculpture of a flying angel. It is surrounded by a glass barrier because for decades, visitors would kiss the stone, leaving thousands of lipstick marks. It is a site of pilgrimage. People leave flowers, letters, and cigarettes. They weep for the man who taught the world that to love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. Wilde has been canonized. He is the patron saint of the outcast, the artist, and the martyr. His shame has become his glory. Now go to Crawley, West Sussex. Find the grave of Lord Alfred Douglas. It is quiet. There are no lipstick marks. There are no crowds. It is the resting place of a man who had everything: beauty, wealth, title, and the love of a genius, and threw it all away because he couldn't control his temper. The relationship between Wilde and Douglas is the ultimate cautionary tale. It teaches us that love is not enough. Love without character, love without responsibility, is just arson. Wilde was a man who could not say no to beauty. Douglas was a man who could not hear the word no. When those two forces collided, they created a fire that burned down the Victorian age. We often ask, did Bosie ruin Oscar? The answer is yes. He pulled the trigger, but Oscar handed him the gun. Wilde's fatal flaw was his inability to see the ugliness inside the beautiful shell. He worshipped youth, and youth destroyed him. In the end, the love that dare not speak its name became the story that the world cannot stop telling. But in this story, there is only one hero. The other is just a beautiful, terrifying warning. Bosie survived the law, the scandal, and the war, but he did not survive the judgment of time. He remains forever the petulant boy in the shadow of the giant, the man who killed the thing he loved and then complained that it died.